Why the taint on his name? Why so much vitriol for the guy? Is this just standard rewriting American history that's dumped on everyone for some social credit these days? Is that all it is?
Well, I think that's part of it. I don't think that's all of it. There was a great revival of Jackson in the 1920s and the 1930s. He had been very popular throughout the 19th century, but then had somewhat fallen out of favor after the American Civil War. And yet he comes back into this great reputation in the 1920s and 30s. But part of the reason that he came back with such a reputation in the 30s was actually a defense of Franklin Roosevelt's strong presidency. And so Democratic historians, people like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., other figures, were trying to find a precedent for Franklin Roosevelt. And they found it in Andrew Jackson, the very first Democratic president of the United States. That is, the first representative of the Democratic Party as president. And so in the 1930s, there was a huge revival of Jackson. That revival really lasted until the late 1990s. And then you can watch from the late 1990s, especially with the debates around Columbus Day, on the 500th anniversary of Columbus, and or kind of a rediscovery of the American Indian within U.S. history, you see that Jackson's reputation just precipitously declines. So he goes from being about the fifth most popular president in American history to something now, and I haven't checked the polls recently, but he would be somewhere around number 20, so right in the middle overall. Still enough to respect to get him in the upper echelon of presidents, but really in the middle overall.
Speaking of Dr. Bradley Birzer, author of the book I Want You to Read. Everyone, ever since I talked about Jackson, everyone asks me, what book to read, what book to read? This is the book to read in defense of Andrew Jackson. All right, now, one of the things that's difficult for people to defend or talk about is Trail of Tears. Anytime you bring up Andrew Jackson, that's all you hear is Trail of Tears, Trail of Tears. And I don't think there's anybody on the planet who celebrates frog marching 15,000 Indians across, having 2,000 of them die. That's not exactly one of our bright and shiniest moments, but there is some background to all of this. They didn't just wake up one day and decide to do it. Isn't there some background?
Yeah, there is. And I mean, Jesse, it's a complicated story. And at the time, Jackson was actually considered a moderate on this issue. There were people who were very extreme about removing all of the American Indians as quickly as possible. And then there are others who were deeply opposed to the removal of American Indians. Jackson himself was not anti-Indian. There were certain Indians that he warred with. There's no doubt about that. But he, for example, had an Indian child that he adopted and raised as his own son. He fought with American Indians in his own militia. In fact, probably about a third of his militia was made up of Indian allies, especially when they fought at New Orleans in 1815 against the British at the very end of the War of 1812. So he himself was not constitutionally against the American Indian. He did believe very strongly that the American Indians, especially in the American South, were being abused by their white neighbors. And so one of the things that he wanted to do was remove them out of harm's way and send them, if they were from northern tribes, to Kansas, and if they were from southern tribes, to Oklahoma. This was seen as kind of permanent Indian territory. In fact, the line called the 95th Meridian, which goes through roughly what's Kansas City now, was regarded as the great dividing line between what would be American white civilization and what would be Native American civilization. And that dream of keeping the Great Plains in Oklahoma and Kansas as an Indian country lasted for quite a while. Oklahoma, of course, to this day is still in many ways Indian territory. But the removal itself was just an absolute humanitarian disaster and nightmare. So, for example, the Choctaw Indians, who were considered one of the 5 civilized tribes of the South. They had their own republic, they had their own language, their own newspaper, they had a very serious economic profile within the South, which is one of the reasons that white Southerners wanted to get rid of them. But when they were removed, there was something like 19,000 members of the Choctaw tribe. During removal itself, which took place over a couple of months, that number was reduced by almost 6,000. And then when the 12,000 remaining made it to Oklahoma, none of the supplies that they had been promised by the US government were there. And so they arrive in the middle of winter and about another 6,000 die. So this is astounding. If you think about just from a humanitarian standpoint, you start out in 1830 with roughly 19,000 Choctaw. And by the end of that winter, there are only about 6,000 left. That's horrific by any measure. That wasn't, of course, Jackson's intention, but that was a logistical nightmare.
You like that? You can learn a whole lot more about Andrew Jackson. The dude was a stud, but you have to do this. You have to do this. It's real simple. thefirsttv.com/support. You do know that this human being got attacked by an assassin when he was 70-some years old and almost beat someone to death with his cane, right? Yeah. thefirsttv.com/support. You enjoyed that. You'll enjoy the whole thing. Trust me.